Fort Sumter, Charleston, South Carolina. Hi, this is Jim from RV 4x40. Welcome to our channel today. We're glad you could join us. We're going to take a quick look at the Fort Sumter and Fort Moultrie National Historical Park in Charleston, South Carolina. Give you some of the history and some pictures and a little bit of video about our tour of the National Historical Site. Fort Sumter, of course, was known as the beginning of the Civil War when active fighting broke out between South Carolina and the Union forces. And so we'll try to give you a little bit of that history as we go along. Charleston, South Carolina was established in 1670 as Charlestown, named for King Charles II of England. It moved in 1680 to its current location, just south of the midpoint of South Carolina's coast. Charleston Harbor is an inlet from the Atlantic, formed by the confluence of the Ashley, Cooper, and Wando rivers. By 1690, it was the fifth largest city in North America. It played a major role in the slave trade, which was the source of the city's wealth. The area was dominated by a combination of plantation owners and slave traders. Some estimates say that nearly half of all Africans brought to America came through Charleston. During the American Revolution, the British thought the Loyalists in South Carolina would rise up to help them. But by then, Britain had outlawed the slave trade and thus antagonized the dominant political forces in South Carolina. Charleston was considered a major prize and had both success and failure during the war, with the city occupied by British troops for a considerable period. Fort Sumter had been authorized as part of a series of fortifications along the southern U.S. coast after the War of 1812. Construction started in 1829, but was still incomplete in 1861 when the Civil War began. Construction started by building up a sandbar in Charleston Harbor with 70,000 tons, that's 140 million pounds, of granite shipped in from New England. The fort was a five-sided brick structure with each side 170 to 190 feet long. Walls were 5 feet thick and stood 5 stories tall. During the Battle of Fort Sumter, the brick walls were not able to withstand the cannon attack, and the height was reduced to about 20 feet. By 1860, the tension between North and South over political dominance and the expansion of slavery into the new parts of the United States had reached a near boiling point. In the 1860 election, the dominant Democratic Party fractured, with 4 candidates running against Abraham Lincoln from the new Republican Party. This allowed Lincoln, with less than 40% of the popular vote, but more than anyone else, to secure the election in the Electoral College. Many of the southern states had promised to secede from the Union if Lincoln were elected, fearing that he would move to abolish slavery. While Lincoln had spoken against slavery, his record before being elected, both written and spoken, was that he didn't believe that it was possible to outlaw slavery where it existed, but was adamantly opposed to allowing it to expand as the United States continued to grow toward the West Coast. After his election and before his inauguration, he steadfastly refused to comment further on his intentions, insisting that his written record on the subject was plain and that he had not changed it. It was not the first time states had threatened to secede. Massachusetts was one of the first states to make the promise, but none had actually gone that far before. South Carolina was the most vociferous state in proclaiming the right and the necessity of secession following the election, and the first state to actually declare itself no longer part of the United States on December 20th, 1860. Various negotiations were going on for South Carolina to take possession of all Union property in the state and to compensate the Union for the property, but these negotiations would not succeed. There was a small garrison in the various forts in Charleston, commanded by Major Robert Anderson. The Confederate government made several demands for the surrender of the Union forts, but Anderson refused as he had no orders other than to maintain his garrison there. He consolidated his forces at Fort Sumter as being the most defensible position, although he had few men and was short of supplies. The first firing of weapons was not on Fort Sumter, but on the Star of the West. This was a commercial schooner dispatched with supplies for Anderson and the troops in Charleston. It wasn't even a regular military action, but cadets at the Southern Carolina Military Academy, now known as the Citadel, opened fire on the ship as it tried to reach the fort. The captain, being in charge of a chartered commercial ship and not a Navy vessel, turned around and sailed back to New York without delivering his cargo. This was January 9, 1861, just weeks after South Carolina had seceded, but before other states had followed and formed the Confederacy. On Thursday, April 11, 1861, a delegation was sent to deliver an ultimatum to Major Anderson to surrender the fort. The ultimatum allowed for Anderson to withdraw his troops with full honors to him and the U.S. flag, but Anderson replied he had no choice but to fulfill his duty and obligation to the United States and remain at the fort. On Friday, April 12th at 4:30 a.m., Confederate forces opened cannon fire on Fort Sumter, marking the first action by an organized military force against the forces of the United States. Anderson did not return fire for more than 2 hours because of limited ammunition. And what he had was of little use because he had no fuses for the explosive shells. They were just firing dead-weight projectiles. The Union forces fired slowly and stopped completely at night due to a shortage of ammunition. Finally, on April 13th, the fort surrendered and evacuated. During the attack, the Union colors fell, and Lieutenant Norman J. Hall risked his life to climb up and put them back, burning off his eyebrows permanently in the process. None of the Union troops were killed during the bombardment, but one did die during a 100-shot salute after the battle. That was the only Union fatality. A Confederate soldier died from wounds suffered when a cannon he was manning misfired. After the war, the fort was in ruins, and the U.S. Army worked to rebuild it. The fort walls were lowered, having been severely damaged. From 1876 to 1897, Fort Sumter was an unmanned lighthouse. At the start of the Spanish-American War, the fort again underwent reconstruction with improvements to its armament, but the fort never again saw combat. It was deactivated in 1947, and in 1948 became Fort Sumter National Monument under control of the National Park Service. Today, the Fort Sumter and Fort Moultrie National Historical Park encompasses 3 sites in Charleston: the original Fort Sumter, the Fort Sumter Visitor Education Center, and Fort Moultrie on Sullivan's Island. Access to the fort is by private boat or a ferry ride from Charleston. On the day we visited, there were 2 ferries that offered an option to stay at the fort, going out on one ferry but skipping its return about an hour later and returning after the last ferry several hours after the first one. We took that option, and having been at the fort with a number of other passengers from the first boat, there was just the 2 of us and 3 or 4 park rangers alone on the island. It's a highly unusual feeling in a national park, especially one so small, to be essentially alone and free to explore without anyone else in sight. It was a beautiful day and a very interesting wrinkle on our trip to Fort Sumter. Charleston has a long and storied history as part of the United States, then as part of the Confederate States of America, then returning to the United States again after the end of the Civil War. We hope you've enjoyed this quick tour through Fort Sumter and had a chance to take a look at it. It's a very historical site, well known in most of the U.S. history. If you like the video, please give it a thumbs up, and if you haven't already subscribed to the channel, it would help us out greatly if you would do that. In the meantime, as we travel the highways and byways of America, we hope to see you somewhere on the road.